Imagine a woman who has seen the rise and fall of dreams, the betrayal of time, and the quiet triumphs no one applauded. She speaks less, listens more, and moves through life with a presence that demands no explanation. This is the wisdom only 70 years can teach, a power found, not in words, but in the silence between them. The power of inner authority does not arrive suddenly. It is cultivated through years of conflict between who a woman is told to be and who she quietly senses herself to be. In early life, authority is almost always external. It comes from parents, culture, religion, partners, and institutions that define what is acceptable, admirable, or worthy. A woman learns to listen outward before she ever listens inward. Her instincts are often overridden by expectations, her doubts silenced by duty, and her intuition dismissed as impractical or emotional. For many years, she survives by adapting, by wearing masks that allow her to belong, even when those masks slowly distance her from her own inner truth. As life progresses, these adaptations begin to fracture. The psyche grows restless when it is forced to live according to borrowed values. Symptoms appear not always dramatic, but persistent. Fatigue without cause, dissatisfaction without explanation, anxiety that does not respond to reassurance. These are not signs of weakness. They are signals from the deeper self demanding recognition. Inner authority begins its slow emergence here, not as confidence, but as discomfort. It asks difficult questions. Why am I living this life? Who am I loyal to? What part of me has been exiled to keep the peace? Through repeated disappointments, betrayals, and losses, a woman learns that external authority is unreliable. People change, promises break, roles dissolve. The structures she once leaned on fail to provide meaning. This is a psychological turning point. When outer guidance collapses, the psyche is forced inward. Inner authority is born not from success, but from disillusionment. It is shaped in moments where no advice helps, no approval satisfies, and no rule book applies. In these moments, a woman is left alone with her conscience, her values, and her intuition. With age, especially by 70, this inner voice grows clearer because it has been tested repeatedly. It has survived being ignored, punished, and doubted. It has watched the consequences of not listening to it. Inner authority is not impulsive. It is refined by reflection. It does not shout. It speaks with quiet certainty. A woman who has developed it no longer needs constant reassurance because she trusts her own judgment. She has learned that confusion often arises when she betrays herself, not when life is uncertain. This authority is deeply connected to individuation, the process of becoming one's true self rather than a reflection of collective expectation. As a woman ages, the need to perform femininity, agreeability, or sacrifice her inner life weakens. She recognizes how often she once confused compliance with goodness. Inner authority corrects this confusion. It teaches that self-respect is not selfishness, and boundaries are not cruelty. Saying no becomes an act of psychological integrity rather than rebellion. A crucial aspect of inner authority is the integration of inner opposites. Earlier in life, a woman may have split herself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. Strength was hidden to preserve likability, anger suppressed to maintain harmony, ambition minimized to avoid judgment. With maturity, she understands that wholeness requires reclaiming what was disowned. Inner authority allows her to hold complexity without guilt. She can be both nurturing and firm, compassionate and decisive, silent and unyielding. This balance does not come from ideology but from lived experience. Inner authority also transforms how a woman relates to others. She no longer seeks permission to feel what she feels or to know what she knows. Advice is received, but it is filtered through her own inner compass. Criticism loses its power to destabilize her identity. Praise no longer defines her worth. Relationships become more honest because they are no longer rooted in the need for validation. She does not abandon connection, she abandons dependency. By Sandy. Inner authority is inseparable from acceptance of mortality. Awareness of limited time sharpens discernment. There is little desire to explain herself endlessly or justify choices to those unwilling to understand. Energy is conserved. Attention is selective. This is not withdrawal from life but a deeper engagement with what feels essential. Inner authority allows her to live from the inside out rather than the outside in. This authority is also deeply moral, though not moralistic. It is guided by an internal sense of rightness rather than rigid rules. A woman guided by it can sit with ambiguity without panic. She understands that life is not meant to be perfectly resolved. Her decisions are aligned with her inner truth even when they are difficult or misunderstood. There is a quiet dignity in this alignment, a sense of standing firmly within oneself, without needing to dominate or submit. Ultimately, the power of inner authority is the power to live in psychological truth. It is the end of inner civil war. The woman no longer fragments herself to survive. She becomes whole enough to trust herself, strong enough to stand alone, and grounded enough to remain open without losing herself. Detachment without coldness is one of the most misunderstood achievements of psychological maturity. In early life, attachment is often confused with love, and endurance is mistaken for loyalty. A woman learns to equate closeness with sacrifice and commitment with self-erasure. She remains present even when unseen, gives even when depleted, and stays even when her inner life begins to wither. This form of attachment is driven not by love, but by fear, the fear of abandonment, of being unchosen, of becoming invisible. Detachment, then, is initially perceived as a threat to connection, as if loosening one's grip would drain life of warmth and meaning. Yet time reveals a quieter truth. What exhausts the soul is not caring too deeply, but caring without discernment. As years accumulate, especially by the seventh decade of life, a woman has witnessed enough endings to understand that nothing held by force remains alive. People change, roles expire, and identities dissolve. When attachment is rooted in possession or obligation, it breeds resentment. Detachment begins not as withdrawal, but as a correction, a rebalancing of the psyche that seeks harmony rather than control. This form of detachment does not emerge from bitterness. It arises from insight. A woman slowly recognizes that she cannot carry another person's fate, heal wounds they refuse to face, or live a life on their behalf. In youth, the boundary between self and other is often porous. She absorbs emotions that are not hers, assumes responsibility for outcomes beyond her control, and confuses empathy with self-sacrifice. Detachment without coldness restores the natural boundary between inner and outer worlds. It allows compassion to exist without entanglement. Psychologically, this detachment is an act of differentiation. The woman no longer defines herself through the needs, expectations, or projections of others. She becomes aware of how often she once lived as a mirror, reflecting back what was required to maintain harmony. With age, this pattern loses its grip. She learns that love does not require constant presence, explanation, or rescue. In fact, true love often requires distance, space for each person to encounter their own inner reality. This detachment carries a distinct emotional tone. It is calm rather than reactive. Where once she may have argued, pleaded, or overextended herself to preserve a bond, she now observes. Observation replaces compulsion. She notices when relationships become draining, when conversations circle without growth, when proximity demands the abandonment of self. Detachment allows her to step back without hatred and remain silent without guilt. This silence is not punishment, it is preservation. Importantly, detachment without coldness does not erase tenderness. A woman can feel deeply while refusing to be consumed. She can grieve without clinging, remember without longing, and love without attachment to outcome. This emotional posture emerges from acceptance of human limitation, of impermanence, of the impossibility of controlling life's unfolding. By 70, she has learned that suffering often arises not from loss itself, but from resistance to loss. There is also a reconciliation with solitude that accompanies this detachment. Earlier in life, being alone may have felt like failure or rejection. With maturity, solitude becomes restorative. It is no longer a void to be filled, but a space where the psyche can breathe. Detachment allows a woman to enjoy connection without fearing its absence. She no longer stays in situations that demand self-betrayal to avoid loneliness. This freedom transforms her relationships. Those that remain are chosen, not endured. This psychological distance also protects against projection. She recognizes when others attempt to place their unmet needs, unresolved wounds, or expectations upon her. Instead of absorbing these projections, she allows them to pass through. This is not indifference, it is clarity. She understands that carrying what is not hers distorts her inner balance. Detachment preserves the integrity of the self, while allowing others the dignity of their own journey. As mortality becomes more present, detachment gains urgency and precision. There is less time for emotional entanglements that lead nowhere. A woman becomes selective, not out of superiority, but out of reverence for her remaining energy. She invests where reciprocity exists and releases where it does not. This release is quiet. There are no dramatic exits or declaration. Detachment without coldness does not need to announce itself. At its deepest level, this detachment is an expression of inner freedom. The woman is no longer ruled by the fear of loss or the need to be needed. She stands rooted in herself, able to extend warmth without attachment and withdraw without resentment. Her presence becomes steady, her compassion grounded, her love uncluttered. In this state, detachment does not diminish connection, it purifies it, allowing relationships to exist without possession, obligation, or fear. The integration of the shadow is one of the most demanding psychological tasks of a lifetime, and it is rarely undertaken willingly in youth. Early in life, a woman learns which parts of herself are welcomed and which are not. Traits that disrupt harmony, threaten approval, or contradict cultural ideals are pushed aside. Anger becomes silence, desire becomes guilt, ambition becomes modesty, grief becomes composure. These rejected aspects do not disappear. They retreat into the unconscious, where they continue to influence behavior indirectly. The shadow is formed not from what is evil, but from what was forbidden. For many years, the shadow expresses itself through projection. A woman reacts intensely to traits in others that mirror what she has disowned in herself. She may resent assertiveness while suppressing her own strength, condemn selfishness while neglecting her own needs, or fear chaos while denying her own emotional depth. These reactions are not moral judgments but psychological signals. They indicate inner division. As long as the shadow remains unconscious, it governs behavior from behind the scenes, shaping choice. Through compulsion rather than awareness, life has a way of disrupting this inner split. Crises arrive that cannot be managed by the socially acceptable self alone. Betrayal, loss, aging, illness, or disillusionment strip away the polished persona and expose raw, inner material. At these moments, the shadow presses forward, not to destroy but to be seen. By the time a woman reaches advanced age, she has encountered herself often enough to recognize that her suffering was not caused solely by circumstances, but by the refusal to acknowledge her full nature. Integration begins with honesty. This honesty is not self-condemnation, but recognition. A woman starts to admit what she feels without justifying it, to acknowledge impulse without acting them out, to recognize patterns without romanticizing them. She realizes that moral purity is an illusion and that psychological wholeness requires the acceptance of contradiction. She is both generous and resentful, loving and capable of withdrawal, wise and capable of error. These opposites do not cancel each other, they coexist. With age, the fear of self-knowledge diminishes. There's less need to appear virtuous and more need to be real. A woman may feign. While I acknowledge anger, she was never allowed to express grief. She never had time to feel or desire she buried to remain acceptable. The shadow often carries vitality. When it is rejected, life feels muted. When it is integrated, energy returns. Creativity, clarity, and grounded strength emerge not from positivity, but from completeness. Integration also dissolves excessive judgment toward others. As a woman becomes familiar with her own darkness, she loses the illusion of moral superiority. This does not make her permissive, it makes her discerning. She understands that human behavior is shaped by unconscious forces, unresolved wounds, and inherited patterns. This understanding softens her without weakening her. Compassion becomes possible without naivety. The shadow also contains unrealized potential. Many women discover late in life that their suppressed assertiveness was actually leadership, that their repressed anger was self-respect, that their denied independence was wisdom. Integration allows these qualities to emerge in refined form. They no longer erupt destructively because they are no longer denied. What was once dangerous becomes useful when consciously held. As time shortens, the psyche naturally moves toward wholeness. There is less patience for inner fragmentation. A woman recognizes that pretending to be only light creates imbalance. The shadow is not an enemy of the soul, it is a necessary counterweight. Without it, identity becomes brittle, relationship has become performative, and wisdom remains shallow. Integration allows her to live without inner censorship, to speak with authenticity, and to act without internal sabotage. This process also transforms guilt. Much guilt dissolves when a woman realizes that many of her so-called flaws were adaptations to survive environments that did not support her full self. She begins to forgive herself not by excusing behavior, but by understanding its origins. This understanding brings relief. The inner critic loses authority when its voice is recognized as inherited rather than absolute. By later life, the integrated woman no longer strives to be exemplary. She strives to be aligned. Her morality is internal, guided by awareness rather than repression. She is less shocked by her own thoughts and less threatened by her own emotions. This stability does not come from control, but from familiarity. She has met herself in many forms and survived each encounter. The integration of the shadow does not make life easier, but it makes it truer. It replaces inner conflict with inner dialogue, self-betrayal with self-recognition, and fear with grounded presence. The woman who has undertaken this work stands with both feet in her humanity, no longer fragmented by what she once tried to deny, no longer divided against herself. Time as a truth teller is a reality that few fully comprehend until the weight of decades settles upon them. In youth, time feels elastic, a servant to desire, ambition, and fear. Moments are infinite, mistakes seem recoverable, and illusions are tolerated because the consequences appear distant. A woman may chase approval, strive for recognition, and build facades to meet expectations, believing that tomorrow will always offer a second chance to correct, justify, or hide. In this phase of life, time is largely unobserved, a background against which drama, achievement, and disappointment play out. It is only in the quiet accumulation of years that its voice becomes undeniable. As a woman ages, time begins to assert itself with clarity. The illusions that once seemed permanent fade, not violently, but inexorably. Relationships reveal their nature, both genuine and superficial. Career achievements are assessed not in trophies or titles, but in the meaning they held for her inner self. The trivial preoccupations that once seemed urgent, jealousies, rumors, material pursuit, appear small and often absurd when measured against the steady progression of life's river. Time speaks in the language of consequence. Choices made decades earlier resonate now in ways that cannot be ignored, and those deferred or denied echo in the psyche like persistent shadows. By 70, a woman has lived long enough to observe patterns she could not see in youth. Time becomes a mirror, reflecting back what truly mattered and what was wasted in pursuit of illusion. It exposes the futility of certain anxieties and the permanence of certain virtues. With each passing year, the distinction between appearance and reality sharpens. The woman who has listened learns that the world is indifferent to pretense, that character cannot be hidden, and that truth, however delayed, always emerges. In this sense, time is both revealer and teacher, gentle in some respects, merciless in others. This revelation through time brings perspective. Decisions that once seemed catastrophic may now appear formative. Moment, once misunderstood, are seen as crucial junctures in the shaping of self. The woman begins to perceive that life's most valuable truths are rarely immediate. They emerge only after reflection, often long after events themselves have passed. The consequences of neglect, misjudgment, or betrayal become clear. Conversely, acts of courage, honesty, and compassion, even when unnoticed, reveal their value over decades. Time, therefore, is impartial. It does not favor pride or shame, only the unfolding of reality. There is also a deepening awareness of impermanence. Time teaches that all forms, relationships, health, opportunities, and even youth itself are transient. In youth, impermanence feels abstract or frightening. With age, it becomes intimate, a daily companion. By 70, a woman has seen friends and loved ones fade, her own body change, and the world around her shift. This awareness sharpens discernment. She no longer clings to illusions of control. She accepts the inevitability of endings and transition. In doing so, she learns a profound freedom to value the present not for its promise of permanence but for the authenticity it offers now. Time also clarifies self-knowledge. A woman can no longer deceive herself about her priorities, her strengths, or her weaknesses. She sees where she has compromised, where she has persisted, and where she has denied her own needs. The mind, memory, and heart become instruments of reflection, tracing the cumulative truth of her existence. Past actions cannot be undone, but they can be understood. Time teaches that self-deception may offer temporary comfort, but truth endures. This lesson is often accompanied by a quiet humility, a recognition that life is larger than any single desire or fear, yet intimate enough to reveal the subtle workings of the soul. Furthermore, time as a truth teller illuminates the illusions projected by others. A woman witnesses how relationships once trusted can falter, how adoration can prove conditional, and how social appearances often conceal inner reality. She learns to discern authenticity without cynicism, to value sincerity over flattery, and to recognize manipulation without bitterness. Time refines judgment, teaching that wisdom arises not from avoidance of error but from observation of its consequences. Each experience, whether painful or rewarding, becomes a data point in a map of reality that only patience and longevity can reveal. In the final decades, time imparts an ethical clarity. The urgency of mortality sharpens moral awareness. A woman realizes that life is too short for trivial quarrels, grudges, or self-deception. She chooses where to invest her energy, attention, and affection with a precision unavailable in earlier years. Time, in this way, acts as both teacher and guide. It shows not only what is true, but what matters. Decisions are no longer reactive but intentional, informed by decades of observation, reflection, and lived consequence. The superficial falls away, leaving the essential visible, undeniable, and actionable. Ultimately, time as a truth teller is not merely chronological. It is psychological, spiritual, and moral. It reveals the patterns of the psyche, the outcomes of choices, and the impermanence of all things external. By 70, a woman has internalized this lesson. Life cannot be faked, postponed, or avoided. Truth emerges slowly but surely through the patient accumulation of experience. In its silence, time speaks louder than any counsel, more reliably than any promise, and with a finality that is at once sobering and liberating. To have listened to it is to understand life not as a sequence of events, but as a reflection of reality itself. The wisdom of silence is a mastery few attain, for most of life is spent in noise, external chatter, internal argument, and the compulsive need to justify, explain, or perform. In youth, a woman often measures herself by how well she is heard, how effectively she can persuade, and how readily her presence is acknowledged. Speaking, asserting, and defending become strategies of survival. Words are used to create identity, establish value, and negotiate belonging. Yet, in this constant expression, the inner self is often drowned, and the voice of intuition, reflection, and subtle understanding is overlooked. Silence in these years is feared. It is equated with absence, weakness, or invisibility. With time, a deeper truth emerges. Silence is not emptiness. It is a presence, a vessel, a space in which the psyche can breathe and observe. By 70, a woman has experienced enough lives to recognize that words are not always the medium of truth. Explanation does not always clarify. Reasoning does not always illuminate. And justification often distorts rather than reveals. Silence becomes a language, a means of understanding without distortion, and a way of witnessing the world without imposing upon it. It is through silence that subtlety, nuance, and depth can be perceived, for the spoken word often simplifies what is complex and flattens what is rich. This wisdom arises from self-possession. A woman who has cultivated silence has reached a point where her worth is no longer contingent on articulation or approval. She no longer feels compelled to rationalize her choices, defend her emotions, or explain her presence. In this stillness, her authority is palpable, not because she dominates conversation, but because she is anchored in herself. Silence becomes a demonstration of confidence, a refusal to dilute the self for the sake of others' comfort, and a recognition that presence alone communicates more than speech ever could. Silence also fosters deep listening. When a woman no longer speaks to perform, she listens to understand. She observes gestures, notices subtleties in tone, and perceives the unsaid currents in relationships. In this state, communication transcends words. Insight arises not from argument but from attentiveness. She learns that human beings reveal more in what they cannot articulate than in what they can, and that the psyche often expresses its deepest truths in gestures, hesitations, and silences. By holding space without intrusion, she allows life and others to reveal themselves authentically. This capacity itself becomes a source of power. There is a paradoxical generosity in silence. In youth, speaking often seeks recognition or validation. In age, silence permits freedom for herself and for others. She no longer imposes expectations, nor does she attempt to control perception. Her silence allows space for thought, reflection, and emergence. It is not avoidance but discernment. By speaking less, she ensures that what is spoken carries weight, clarity, and authenticity. She discovers that influence is not always proportional to volume. Often, the quietest presence leaves the deepest imprint. Silence also cultivates resilience. Without the constant need to explain or defend, a woman's psyche becomes less vulnerable to external turbulence. Criticism, misunderstanding, and conflict no longer destabilize her as they once did, for she understands that the need for validation is transient, while the authority of self-awareness endures. In silence, She is shielded from distraction and the erosion of energy. Her inner life gains space, her judgments sharpen, and her attention becomes precise. She has learned that not every situation demands intervention. Not every conflict requires voice, and not every challenge is hers to rectify. This wisdom is intimately tied to introspection. In the quiet, she meets herself without distraction or performance. She hears the whispers of intuition, the subtle urgencies of the soul, and the long rhythms of her own psychological life. In these moments, she reconciles with fear, desire, regret, and hope. She can observe the shadow without judgment, acknowledge mortality without panic, and recognize the pattern of her life without distortion. Silence becomes a medium for self-integration, a conduit through which the fragmented psyche slowly achieves coherence and balance. Moreover, silence deepens relationships. A woman who speaks less, impulsively listens more empathetically. Her interactions gain substance and resonance. She understands that connection does not require constant affirmation, and that intimacy is often cultivated in shared, quiet rather than ceaseless discourse. Through silence, she conveys trust, presence, and respect. Others feel seen without the pressure of performance, and she experiences closeness without surrendering selfhood. It is a wisdom that combines strength with compassion, authority with humility, and clarity with patience. Ultimately, the wisdom of silence is the mastery of presence. It allows a woman to live fully without performing, to act deliberately without over-explaining, and to observe deeply without intrusion. It teaches that words, while necessary, are limited, and that understanding, power, and peace often reside in the spaces between them. Silence is both refuge and revelation, restraint and expression, discipline and liberation. By 70, a woman who has embraced this wisdom understands that the loudest truths are often unspoken, the strongest influence is often quiet, and the deepest presence is often still. In this mastery, she carries the serenity, insight, and authority of a life fully observed. By 70, a woman has learned what cannot be taught in books or classrooms. She has discovered the authority of her own voice, the freedom of detachment, the depth of her shell, the clarity of time, and the transformative power of silence. These lessons are not loud, they are not demanded, they are earned, and in embracing them she lives fully, loves wisely, and stands unshakable in the truth of who she has become.